All right, AP World History students, this is your chapter 22. This will be your final chapter of Unit 3 for your test. A lot of this is kind of an overview of sort of some of the things that we've talked about. It hits big on cross-cultural interaction, basically our trade networks. And then at the end, it's going to throw a little bit of Renaissance in there for good measure. Okay, so absolutely you have to know the Silk Roads without a doubt. Understand that the Silk Roads stretching from the east, from China through India, across Central Asia, into the Middle East, and into Europe, basically. That the Silk Roads are many, it's not just one. And it also counts as sea lanes in the Indian Ocean basin as well, because it will travel those routes as well. Of course, the trans-Saharan caravan routes are coming from the Middle East through North Africa, across the Sahara Desert, and into sub-Saharan Africa. We've talked about that in a chapter. They're very important. And these massive long-distance trade networks are going to develop trading cities that fall along those routes, these emporias, these warehouses, basically, of all these goods that have been manufactured in these areas. Now, nomadic invasions such as Turks and Mongols cause local devastation, but especially with the Mongols, we're going to see how it actually expands massively this long-distance trade network, without a doubt. Name you need to know for sure is Marco Polo. We know that he's a Venetian European who, from Italy, who travels east and winds up somehow in Kublai Khan's Mongol court out in China. He's there for 17 years doing great things as a translator and a diplomat for the Great Khan. And he's going to go back to Venice, and he ends up landing himself in prison where a fellow prisoner is going to write down his experiences. And these writings, the travels of Marco Polo, are going to be very influential because he tells these fantastical tales, and it gets Europeans, the West, interested in these great and advanced societies in the East, especially, of course, China. And here you can see his travels, Marco Polo being in blue. Okay, so he leaves out here in Italy, and you can see he's going to have quite the journey. Sea and land, everything in between. For his time period, his only rival really is Ibn Battuta, the Muslim traveler we'll talk about here in a second. Right, now trade required diplomatic relations after 1000 CE, meaning that empires and kingdoms are having to negotiate and talk with each other to make sure that the long distance trade it's beneficial to everyone, basically, and everybody's kind of getting their piece of the pie. Not always equal pieces of the pie, of course, but everybody's getting their fill. Now, Mongols and Christians in this time period early on recognized Muslims as a common enemy by the 13th century, by the 1200s. So, of course, you're towards the end of the Crusades by that time, and Mongols are kind of now rising to power. Pope Innocent IV would end up inviting Mongols to convert to Christianity. However, the Mongols counter-offered that Christians could accept Mongol rule or face destruction. So perhaps not the answer the Pope was looking for. All right, here's Robin Sama. He was a Nestorian Christian priest who was sent to the Pope by the Mongols in 1287. And basically, they're proposing an alliance to attack Jerusalem. But there's no European support for this Mongol attack on the Holy City. And by just a few years later, by 1295, the new leader of Persia would end up accepting Islam. Now, big time name you got to know here, Ibn Battuta. He's basically the Muslim Marco Polo, if you will. He was an Islamic scholar who worked in governments on extensive travel. He goes all over the world, as you saw on that other map. And he's very strict Muslim. Lashes for drinking alcohol, hand amputations for theft. But he was unable to convince like the women of the Maldive Islands to cover their breast, and parts of Africa, this would be the case as well. And so while he was able to convert a lot of people to Islam, and he traveled through Islamic lands, he realized very quickly that parts of the world like Africa, their brand of Islam was not going to be the more conservative brand that was being practiced in the Middle East. Now, remember that the Sufis are the best of the Muslim missionaries, and they traveled throughout these new Muslim territories over the course of this 500-year period. Christian missionaries would also accompany and follow the Crusaders from 1095 until early 1200s. Roman Catholic priests traveled east to serve expatriate communities, basically Christians who had fled east. And another name that you might need to know, John of Montecorvino. Basically, he's going to kind of bring Christianity to China in 1291. He translates the biblical text into Chinese. He's building churches. Now, eventually, the Chinese are going to lash out against this, but that's a little bit later. Now, there's a lot of cultural exchanges going on in this time period, thanks to the Crusades and events like that. Songs and stories such as troubadours. Troubadours were basically traveling poets and musicians in Western Europe. That is going to kind of go east a little bit. European scientists consulted with Muslim and Jewish counterparts on the understanding of the natural world. Very important. Remember, the Muslims were a little more advanced. And so these budding European scientists, like kids in a candy store, they're going to learn a lot from the Muslims. The Europeans get the magnetic compass from China, which goes from China to the Arabs. And in the Crusades, the Europeans find out about it from the Arabs. And that's going to be the launching point for the age of exploration. It's really going to, catapult Europe into superstar status on the world stage. Of course, there's a spread of crops, citrus fruits, Asian rice, cotton, sugar, most importantly of all. These food items are going to spread along these trade networks. Muslims introduced crystallized sugar to the Europeans, and as you can imagine, much like myself, they became addicted. That demand increases rapidly. That's going to be another cause for the age of exploration later on, as we being the Europeans, try to cut out the Muslims as the middlemen in this awesome trade. Europeans used Muslim precedent of having large populations of slaves working on sugarcane plantations. The Muslims, for several hundred years, have been getting slaves out of Africa. The Europeans are going to see this, adopt it in the New World, and take it to a new level. Gunpowder, of course, being a very important technology. Muslims and the Mongols spread the use of gunpowder, which originated, of course, in China. That technology would reach Europe by the mid-13th century. And as Europeans were often do, it wasn't that they invented a whole lot of things, but they were really good at taking technologies invented by other cultures and kind of taking them to the next level. There was a little ice age about CA, meaning circa, about 1300 CE, which led to a decline of agricultural output, which of course meant that people began starving. There was widespread famine. 1300s is going to be a difficult time period for the world. The bubonic plague would end up spreading from southwest China. It was carried by the fleas on the backs of rats. These rats would get on the ships, and these ships would set sail for ports, and then the rats would get off the ships and spread the bubonic plague to that port city. And then the ship would move on to another port city, taking the plague with it as it went. It also traveled over land routes as well, but more quickly it would travel by ship. Mongol campaigns spread disease to the Chinese interior. The Mongols covered such a vast area that they actually made it easier to spread the Black Death. Mongols, merchants, travelers, they all spread the disease west. And you can see some time periods here as it makes its way to Europe. What were some of the symptoms of this terrible disease? Inflamed and discolored lymph nodes in the neck, armpit, groin area. You can Google bubonic plague because, it's still out there. It's not a threat like it was back then. So you can actually see some pictures instead of just drawings. About a 60 to 70% mortality rate within days of the symptoms. 3 to 5 days, typically, somebody died. Once you started seeing the buboes appear, almost 3 out of 4 people died. The extreme northern climates were less affected because the winters were harder on the flea population, so they weren't as devastated as some of these other areas. And for some weird reason, India and sub-Saharan Africa were unaffected. They did not get hit by the bubonic plague. whether there's some geographical or climatic reason, or if they were just blind luck, we don't know. But they were not hit by the Black Death. As you can see, it's an unusual time period because population is declining rather than inclining, but they will rebound. It takes them a bit, but within 200 years, they've rebounded. And what you're going to see with the Black Death is that there are actually some positive benefits. It's incredibly sad. It's the worst disaster in human history, but it does change society for the better later on down the line. All right, so what comes from it? Social and economic effects. Well, there's massive labor shortage. You've got all these workers and peasants working in these Western European manors, and so many of them die that the lords who ran away, typically, the lords weren't killed in as big of numbers as peasants were. They make money off their land. And the peasants realize this. They realize for the first time in their history, because of the lack of numbers, they have leverage. So they demand higher wages. The population begins moving, sometimes to towns and cities. Governments ended up attempting to freeze wages and to stop serf movements, but the serfs would riot against this. And they're going to win some, at least some short-term benefits following all this. China's going to have to recover. Remember, it hit there first, killed millions and tens of millions of people in China. The Yuan dynasty collapsed in 1368. Remember, the Yuan dynasty was founded by the Mongols. An impoverished orphan raised by Buddhist monks would end up working his way through military ranks and would eventually become an emperor known as Hongwu. And Hongwu proclaims a new dynasty called the Ming, or the Brilliant Dynasty, which would last for roughly 300 years. Now, the Ming is going to be very centralized. They're going to reestablish, very importantly, the Confucian educational system that the Mongols had not been that interested in. There was an execution of ministers suspected of treason, which began the tradition of direct rule by the emperor. They also relied on emissaries called mandarins. And we know that Mandarin Chinese is a big-time Chinese dialect. There was heavy reliance under the Ming dynasty on eunuchs. They felt less threatened by eunuchs who had been castrated. These were men who had had their parts removed because they didn't feel that they could build a hereditary power base. They were a little delusional on this because removing the man parts did not make these men less ambitious. It just simply meant that they couldn't pass on their power to their children because they couldn't have any children. And the Ming dynasty, their centralized structure would last all the way through the following dynasty, which was the Qing dynasty, which ended in 1911, which would be the last of the Chinese dynasties. All right, economic recovery. Conscripted labor to repair and rebuild irrigation systems out there. Promoted manufacturing of porcelain and silk. The Ming dynasty did. Basically, they're forcing people to work, and they are getting right back on that. We got to ride this porcelain and silk train as far as it'll take us. There was a cultural revival. They attempted to eradicate any trace of the Mongol rule under the Yuan dynasty. So they promoted traditional Chinese culture, of course. One of their big names of the Ming emperors was Yongle, who commissioned a 23,000-row encyclopedia. He also kind of started the age of exploration for the Chinese. He's going to fund Zheng He and 7 voyages. Doesn't talk about it there. And, these voyages, you're talking, 400-foot treasure ships, 27,000 sailors involved in these journeys, massive tribute, whatnot, pretty epic. All right, recovery in Western Europe. We have state building, basically. China becomes centralized empire after the Black Death. Europe starts building up regional states, and Europe develops new taxes. In the Italian states, they had bonds. In France, they had like salt tax and a sales tax. In England, they had a hearth tax, a head tax, a plow tax, lots of taxes. And they began establishing large standing armies. Prior to this time period, European armies were very small. A couple thousand men typically was a large army for them compared to the Mongol armies and the Chinese armies, which were far, far larger, and the Muslim armies, of course. French King Louis the 11th had an army of some 15,000 men. So for his time period, very large. But the French armies will continue to grow, of course, as we move forward through time. In Spain, you had Fernando of Aragon, who ends up marrying Isabel, and that gets you Ferdinand and Isabel, which unites Spain for the first time in like 700 years. It's a very, very important political and economical alliance. This also completed something called the Reconquista. And the Reconquista was a Spanish goal of getting back their country from Muslims. So they would end up, it took them a while, but they would end up rooting out all the Muslims and Jews and getting rid of them and bringing Christianity, Catholicism back to Spain. Ferdinand and Isabella would end up funding Columbus's, the Italian sailor, his quest for China. So he's going to sail west. We also get something called the Renaissance. And in other classes, we spend a lot more time on the Renaissance, but the AP World does not, they're not in love with the Renaissance. It was a rebirth of classical culture. Remember that 476, the Roman Empire had fallen, and for 1,000 years, Europe, while perhaps saying Dark Age isn't a fair assessment, there in many ways they did kind of go backwards. It starts in Italy, and you have Italian artists who are using new art forms called perspective. You're getting three-dimensional objects, and people begin working with real human anatomy and musculature. Da Vinci is cutting into cadavers and drawing what he sees underneath. As far as medicine goes, they're finally, for the first time, cutting open human bodies and charting the insides to help with their medicine. One of the reasons they were so far behind in medicine. As far as architecture went, they began building a lot of domed cathedrals, these imitations of the old Roman domes. You had the rise of humanism, which was very important. And you get these studies, the humanities, still called that today, literature, history, moral philosophy. Renaissance humanists deeply devoted to Christianity. They're going to basically take Greco-Roman logic and reason, sort of pseudoscience, if you will, and they were going to apply it to their faith, to Christianity. Erasmus was perhaps the father of humanism. He published critical Greek-Latin editions of the New Testament, and they were also devoted to rediscovering classical Latin text, which had often been ignored in monastic libraries. They're going back to those Greeks and Romans, and they're restudying what those great minds had come up with so long ago. Humanist moral thought. There was a rejection of the monastic lifestyle in favor of morally virtueless life while engaged in the world. Rather than be a Christian monk hiding out away from the world, you should be a Christian who's going and spreading the faith, that kind of stuff. Reconciliation of Christianity with rapidly changing European society and economy. Basically, society and life is changing in Europe, and Christianity has to change along with it or be left behind. All right, Renaissance Europe and the larger world. Artists expressed interest in Byzantine and the Asian worlds. Mirandola tried to reconcile Plato, Aristotle, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Zoroastrianism. Did not work. Basically meaning he was trying to make them all make sense as one, that they're not different, that they're all the same. Greek science with Aristotle and Plato, Jewish faith, Christian faith, Muslim faith, Persian faith of Zoroastrianism. He couldn't make it work. The Ming Dynasty was hesitant to have a large foreign population in their country because they were burned by the Mongol experience. They did allow small foreign populations to live in the port cities. So you would, kind of like what we would have in America, Chinatown or Little Italy or something like that. They might have Germantown or a British area. Yongle engaged his Admiral Zheng He to mount 7 massive naval expeditions that I was talking about earlier, the 7 voyages they were known as. Again, 400-foot treasure ships, 27,000 people involved, and they just sail along the coast to new places and say, hey, we're the Chinese, we're rich and powerful. And the people are like, yes, you are. We can tell because you're handing out valuable items like gold and silk. This demonstrated the strength of the Ming Dynasty, and it was ultimately successful. However, as the Mongols began presenting a new threat in the north, many of the people in China began feeling like the voyages are a waste of time, and so they abandon them. And this is just 1433 being the last of Zheng He's voyages. It is possible that the Chinese could have discovered the New World prior to Columbus, and this would have greatly changed history and would have made China probably the most powerful of all time. So here is a small map of Chinese and European voyages from 1405 to 1498. And you'll see Columbus, of course, eventually making it to the New World. Before Columbus, we've got Diaz and da Gama scouting out Africa and finding a tip and establishing direct trade. All right. Now, why do you go? Why are Europeans exploring in the Atlantic and Indian Oceans? Very easy to remember. 3 little letters: God, glory, and gold. 3 G's: God, glory, and gold. Portuguese were the early leaders in the Atlantic exploration. They are probing the coast of Africa. They're going to eventually get a direct route around Africa to India. This cuts out Muslims and Italians from the trade. And then, of course, Spain is jealous of Portugal's holdings. And so they take a risk with Columbus, and Columbus finds the New World. And it's a good risk paid off for the Spain, as they will eventually loot the New World, the Aztecs and the Inca, of their gold and silver. All of this really possible because of Prince Henry the Navigator. He's going to found a navigational school that's going to bring new technologies, mapping, and things like that were essential to these European explorers in this time period. You're going to see the colonization of a lot of these Atlantic islands, major investment in sugarcane plantations because sugar is such a valuable cash crop. We see the exploration of the West African coast, and the sad part, the enormous increase in the volume of African slave trade. And ultimately, some 12 million Africans are eventually deported to the Americas for slave labor. The Indian Ocean trade, hugely important as well. This was an attempt to avoid using Muslim middlemen. Again, I've mentioned that. We saw Bartholomew Diaz in 1488. He sails around the Cape of Africa, but he doesn't have the supplies. His men want to go back home, so he goes back home. Vasco da Gama would end up following shortly after, but he would make it all the way to India. And the Portuguese would establish little forts along the coast and stuff to maintain their trade monopoly. They want to make sure that they're the only ones able to use this from Europe. And this begins European imperialism in Asia. As I said, with Columbus, he's got a better idea. He's going to sail west to get east. It's going to be shorter. He miscalculated the diameter of the earth by about 10,000 miles, however. So he's out there for 3 months and is near death by the time he finally makes it to what his people call San Salvador, or Holy Savior. However, he made it, and the rest is history. All right, guys, that is it. And that's going to get us ready and prepared for our Unit 3 test. Good luck. Take